Okay, so welcome back to the next session. Just now we talked about the strategies for communicating change, and before that we also talked about the communication needs for communication and why we need to communicate change. Continuing the same topic, now we are going to talk about what are the different kind of skills that is required by the change managers and also the other stakeholders in the communication process while going for a change. So, the next topic that we are going to discuss here is skills for communicating change, that what are the different kind of skills that people require. Now, when we are going to talk about communication skills in general, right. These skills are aimed at what? Involving people and getting their commitment to the change process. So, you need to ensure that you develop those skills, so that you are able to involve people and encourage their commitment in the change process. And it all depends upon not your strategies, but what kind of skills you have to communicate with the people, right. You will find that some people are good orators, some people are bad orators, and it is because of their communication skills so that they are known and they are able to influence others. So, the communication skill become very important, especially for the change managers, and if they do not have these kind of skills, then they need to ensure that they develop those skills related to the communication, so that they are able to ensure that people participate in the process and they are committed to it, right. See, it is not very important to ensure that issues related to the change can be solved. The idea of communication is to solve certain problems related to the change process, right. The idea here is that you are able to communicate, or you should be able to communicate in such a way with the employees using certain skills or your communication skills to ensure that the intended outcome is achieved, and the pressure that is there both internally and externally on the organization to go for a change is reduced to a larger extent. The idea here is that when you are going to communicate, you are going to talk about what you are going to achieve, right. At the same time, you are also going to talk about the kind of pressure that you have to go for a change, right. So, the difference between intended outcome that you want to have and the pressure that is there for a change, both are to be communicated. So, you need to develop communication skill not only to tell them about the intended outcome of this change, in that is in what way it is going to be good for both the employees as well as the organization, but also ensure that you are able to differentiate between the outcome and why we want to go for it. I mean, what are the forces which are working for the change, and we have already talked about the external and internal pressures for the change, right. And the best way to go for it is to have a dialogue, so that you are able to transform the behavior of the people, their experiences and also the attitude, so that they develop a more positive attitude, they have a positive thinking, they experience something that is not negative, but positive in nature, and that would help the organization to reduce the unintended effect and to ensure that this is going to help employees to accept and go for commitment for the change, and also they are able to participate in the process, and that is why communication skill is very important. Okay. Now, we will discuss something related to what are the various kind of skills and other issues. So, here what I am going to show you is something that how communication basically at different cycles of change takes place. These are the 4 major areas of change that we have been talking about, right. It is going like this. So, we start with the first stage where you acknowledge, okay, and second stage where there is a reaction, the third stage where you go for exploration, and finally, the fourth stage where you go for implementation. Now, if you look at this, you can also find 2 domains. One is from emotional to cognitive domain. Okay. Cognitive domain where you are going to be followed by the logic, the rationale, why you want to go for it. So, you need more knowledge and information. Here you are going to be driven more by emotion, not by logic. Now, if you look at this side, this is basically the past orientation, what you have been doing, and then this future orientation, what you need to do in the future, right. And then you move along this cycle of change now, right. Now, if you look at this at the first stage, where you have information about going for a change and you acknowledge that there is a need to go for a change, right, based upon the past orientation. Here you need to provide information about why we want to go for a change, right. So, the kind of skill that you require would be different compared to the next stage when people start reacting once you talk about going for a change, right. At this stage they are not driven by the logic, because logic works here, okay. There is a pressure and we need to go for a change, right. But here when you actually go for a change, then people may be driven by the emotional state, and here they start reacting, what will happen to them, how it is going to influence them. And at this point of time, the basic idea of communicating is to provide them support, so that you are able to reduce the resistance, right. At the third stage when they go for exploration, right, because you are moving to a future state. So, you need to take them away from this emotional state to a more cognitive state, and here you need to encourage them, right, so that they are ready to accept change, because you tell them about the good things which is likely to happen in future after the change is implemented, right, and then you ask them to explore what is in store for them. And finally, you move to the fourth stage, that is implementation, where you are actually implementing the change, and here you need to reinforce their behavior, so that they develop a more positive attitude, and that would be more reinforcing for the organization and individual employees, because now they have accepted and committed themselves to the change based on the information that is not driven by the emotion, but by the logic that yes, we need to go for it, because there is a question of growth and development, and we cannot remain idle at this stage. We need to move to this stage, and once this is reinforced, then it is always good. So, that you can see here that at all these stages the need for communication become different, as we have discussed earlier also, that at different stages we go for a different kind of strategies for communicating. Here you are going to provide more logical information to present a case for a change. Here you need to provide support. So, your communication strategies accordingly varies. Here you also need to encourage them, so that they take it up more positively, and here you reinforce such behaviors by communicating it in such a way, by like praising, appraising positively, so that when you are going to implement them, it becomes more successful. So, it is very, very important to understand that at various phases of change, what kind of strategies you need to adopt, and at what kind of skills you need to have in order to communicate at various stages of the change. Now, at the first stage what actually happens? These are the typical reactions that people make. They get shocked, feel threatened, denial, okay. They feel distracted, the productivity goes down, right. Now, at this stage what needs to be done? You need to provide them why you want to go for it, why it is good for you, why there is a need for change, then they start reacting. Reactions could be in terms of anger, depression, withdrawal, and then they start bargaining, right. And they think that this not that we go for a change immediately, we can wait for it, right. And then from this stage they go back to stage 1, right. And then the third stage what happens? They display certain behaviors because there is a loss, but they also try to explore future options, makes willingness to explore new options with reservations, and here they are driven more by the emotions, which comes from excitement and anxiety. And fourth stage, they are ready to establish new routines, adapt to the new systems, help others learn new ways, right. So, comfort with change engenders more flexibility, creativity and risk taking, right. So, this is the best thing that to go for, right. Now, here the change is viewed something that has already been established in the system. So, you have already moved from the present state to a desired future state, and that is what we have been talking about here. If you look at this cycle of change, right. So, the need for the communication, the strategies for the communication and the kind of skills that is required at different level is going to be vary, right. So, what is to be done, right. So, these are some certain prescriptions that have been suggested at least especially at the investigating and the implementing stage, right. Do not push them, then do not rush certain choices, okay. Do not punish people if they make certain mistake, okay. And here you need to go for more micromanaging, see what are the choices which they have are available, okay. And make sure that everybody participate in the process, and these are the things that need to be done, right. Create opportunities, ensure participation in decision making process. Also, I tell them what are the positive and negative sides of the change, and if at the implementation stage definitely you need to reward. So, link it with the reward. If they are taking certain risk with the innovation, support it, right, and encourage communication from their side. So, get feedback, right. So, what I am trying to tell you that there are certain behaviors that is expected from the change managers, which could be reinforcing in nature, and these kind of behaviors are going to damage the entire exercise related to successfully implementing the change, and then it may bounce back. So, it is very important to communicate them in such a way. So, that is good. The question is that how are we going to communicate? What are the key skills that is required, right. So, listening is very important. So, you need to listen to the people. The moment you talk about change, you look at their reactions. So, there are 4 type of listening skills that is required: suspending judgments, identifying assumptions, listening for learning and reflecting. It means, when you are going to listen to people or they are going to listen to you, do not make any judgment immediately, because this is where they are trying to explore the possibilities. So, do not make any judgment based on what is being communicated. Do not make any assumptions also, identifying assumptions, okay. And listen to learn. So, to increase your knowledge and skill base, and reflecting. Reflecting means you are able to understand what other person intend to communicate, and so you need to reflect upon that. Okay, this is what I mean to say, and that is how you are going to reflect. So, listening is a very important characteristics so far as communication skill, and it is true for both the stakeholders as well as the change managers. So, both sides should listen to each other. So, this is a very important communication skill. Then coming to the telling stories, and when we are talking about telling stories, this is an effective way of helping employees to learn from the past changes. So, what you need to tell them? The stories, successful change stories that have happened in the organization in the past, right, and how it has helped the organization to grow and further and develop it. So, these kind of stories can be communicated, and also based on this you can present a picture of the future which looks more rosy, more beautiful, and you say that if you are going for a change, then it will be further better, and it would help organization to further grow and develop itself, right. So, based on your past changes, successful changes, basically you communicate it to the employees and also create a picture of the future which looks more rosy and beautiful, so that people are attracted to these kind of things, and that is where your communication skill helps, that how you are going to tell the stories, right. Selling change upward, right. It means you need to gain the confidence of the top management when you go for a change, right. If the change is initiated from the below, if it is coming from the top, then that is not required, right. And the last point is toxic handling. What I mean to say by toxic handling is that, yes, you know that there are some people who are troublemakers, right. So, they would talk more about the ill effects of the change than the good effects of the change, right. And you know that people are more acceptable, or they listen to such people who talk about the ill effects of the change, right. So, you need to shield people and need to ensure that such people who create trouble in the organization by talking about the ill effects are handled properly, and they are not going to influence others in the process, right. So, you need, that is what we call toxic handling. So, those all such toxic people need to be handled and managed effectively, so that they are not going to persuade people, and then people are not going to be influenced by such people to negate the change or not to go for this kind of changes. Moving further, we have talked about these kind of things. Now, out of this we have 5 type of listening, right. We have already discussed about this. Now, 5 type of listening. What are the 5 type of listening? Discriminative. Discriminative in the sense where you are going to discriminate between 2 different kind of perspective, views, right. So, you need to discriminate between what people are saying, what people are not saying, how it is being said. Then comprehension. Comprehending is very important. So, you listen to other and then you are able to comprehend that. So, that it makes sense and you find that it is meaningful or not, right. So, comprehending is very important. So, once you listen, you should be able to comprehend that. So, that you are able to understand exactly what is being communicated. Then therapeutic listening. Therapeutic listening is something different. The idea is to bring about a change in your behavior, and that is what we know as therapeutic listening. So, you need to listen, and then accordingly it should have some kind of intended effect to bring about a change in your attitude and behavior. Then critical listening. Critical listening is something different, where you listen and then you try to be more critic, act like a critic, where you are trying to say that okay, this is what you have said, but these are the points that I would like to make about it, right. So, you are going to be critical in your approach while listening, and then you try to evaluate whatever is the content is there, because you are not going to be critical unless you are going to evaluate the content that is being communicated to you. And finally, appreciative. Appreciative listening is where you are going to appreciate whatever is being communicated, and you find that yes, it is good for you and you want to go for it, right. So, when you are going to talk about appreciative listening, that is where you are able to develop a more positive attitude towards the change. Now, there are 2 kind of listening. Sometimes we say good listener or bad listeners, right. There is nothing like good listeners or bad listeners. The thing is here, the thing that we are talking about here is that when we say good listening, that is, it means that you are able to focus attention on what is being communicated and act upon it, right. And similarly, you are able to present your perspective after the listening, and if that happens, it means the listening is good or otherwise not, right. Then if there is a lack of listening, it means that you are not interested to listen either, or you are not thinking that okay, if you are going to listen, it is going to make a difference, right. So, perceived lack of listening is something that is not good, because it is going to affect the relationship, because if you do not listen to the other person, then the other person will not talk to you, right. So, you need to ensure that you are able to listen and present your perspective to the change managers when you are going to talk about it, and that is where you are going to have different type of listening, whether you are going to be critical, whether you are able to understand it, whether you are going to appreciate it or not, or whether you are able to discriminate between what is being said and what is not being said, right. So, the good listeners can always recognize and use when and how to use their skills, right, and accordingly they would be using these skills to communicate with the change managers. Now, when we talked about listening and then the second point is the telling stories. Okay. When you talk about the past experiences, the past changes that has happened, right. So, these stories include what? The protagonist, right, how things has happened, what we did and how we were able to reach to that level, right. You can talk about certain decisions which were taken by the organization, how this decision has changed the fate of the organization, right. Catalyst prompting information. Catalyst, it means that they do not go for a change, but they stimulate change, right. So, how certain activities or events act as catalyst for the organization to go for a change, and when we went for a change, this is what happened. For example, organizations can say that okay, after this liberalization process, okay, when we were supposed to compete with multinationals, we took a decision, we went for a change, okay, and that actually really helped us to grow and develop, right. Then trails and tribulations means how things have been happening in the past and how it is could be connected with the future, and then turning point. There could be certain turning points in the life of the organization, which have changed the organization to grow and develop. So, you can talk about those turning point and the decisions that have been taken, which could be proved ultimately the turning point for the organization. For example, you have been doing business in one particular area, but you decide ultimately to go for a different kind of products and services. I want to go for a different kind of domain altogether. It could be it could act as a turning point both in good way as well as bad way. Okay. So, if it has been successful, then you can say one decision to go for a different product has been the turning point for the organization, right. And then resolution. Okay. You resolute that yes, this is what we need to do and this is how we can proceed for the future. So, these kind of resolutions can be taken based on past experiences, that if we go by this, probably it would be good for the organization, right. Then the third point that we are going to talk about is selling change upward. It means gaining the senior management attention and confidence, that is very, very important. So, what are the important issues here? How you are going to present something? The logic of going for something that is new, right. How are you going to package the idea, whether it is who has identified it, how are you going to communicate in the senior managements, right, who raised this idea, who is going to package this idea. So, anything that you are going to present to the top management, it must be presented in such a way, so that it looks logical, it is presented in such a way, so that it makes sense, right. And then bundling, not only presenting, but bundling also. How your plan is linked with profit, market share, the image of the organization, how it is going to take care of the stakeholders, because all these are very important to any kind of business plan that you want to suggest to the top management, must be linked with the profit structure, market share and the reputation of the organization. And then you have to see that what are the myths, assumptions and beliefs by which people are being guided in the organization. So, these myths, assumptions and beliefs are very, very important, and if people are speaking out down the line, then it is good. If they are not speaking out, if they are not trying to sell it upward, then it is not good, because if something is coming from the bottom line, then that makes more sense for the organization, and organization should listen to it and go for it, provided they find that it has some kind of say commercial value, and it would be good to go for implementing these kind of changes in the organization. And then toxic handlers, that is very, very important. How are you going to handle toxic handlers? You need to listen them empathetically, you listen to them very well, right. Ask for solutions, right. Ask them that what needs to be done, how we are going to solve this problem. Work behind the scene, right. So, that will going to ease your pain. So, it is not that you are going to work and ask for solutions from them, but you need to ensure that how they are being handled well. So, you need to work even behind the scene, you need to talk them separately, you need to convince them that you tell that what is to be done, how it is to be done, okay. And so that you are able to carry out the confidence in other people. Otherwise, what will happen? These toxic handlers would create more problem for other people, okay. And then if there are certain messages which are difficult, so you reframe it in such a way, so that these toxic handlers are able to understand it, right. The idea here is that you are going to handle the ill effects of the change and shielding the negative impact, and that is where these toxic handlers can create a lot of trouble. So, you need to handle them very strategically, so that they are not able to influence the any kind of change effort, right. So, these are the 4 type of communication skills that we have been talking about here. Now, if you look at the change conversations that happens at each stage of the change, that is also important. For example, at the initiative stage what happens? You need to initiate the conversation. So, we draw attention to the need for the change, and here what we are going to talk about is assertions, requests, declarations are very important. Second stage, understanding, communicates the type of change needed and why, conditions for satisfaction, participation, these kind of things are important. Then third stage, conversion for performance. So, here we are going to have conversations that what kind of change actually is intended, how the progress is being monitored, what are the various obligations that we need to meet, who are accountable for what are the targets and deadlines that we need to meet, right. And finally, once the change is complete, so then the conversation for closure goes on. Here you are giving a signal that yes, this is the end of the change and now we need to finish it out, and then you go for celebrations and rewards. Okay. So, at each stage of the change you need to go for different kind of conversations, and for each of these conversations the kind of communication skills that you need to identify, whether you are going for listening, telling stories, selling change upward, or and then if there are certain issues related to toxic handling that need to be solved, right. And the other issues like defining stages, skills required at each stage. So, at each stage of these change conversations you need to identify what kind of communication skills should be required, and then the power, who is going to enforce these decisions and interpret understanding, whether it is going to be change managers or somebody else. So, when you are going for change conversations, you need to identify not what is to be conversed, but also the kind of skill that would be required at each stage of this conversation. These are the different stages of the change that we have been discussing about. Moving further, when you are going to communicate, the language we have already talked about is very important, right. So, you need to ensure that you are using a language which is very coherent, which makes sense. So, there is no ambiguity in the change messages, and the language that you are using is in sync with the change, right, with the reflective of each other. It means that yes, the language talks about the change. So, you need to talk about you need to talk in the language that reflects change, right. And these are the 4 formats that could be used in change conversations, like ideals, what exactly we should go for, expressing preferences, what should be our preferences, right, appeals, seeking support, right, because you need participation from the stakeholders, their involvement in the change process, and then we are using language which looks more appealing. And here you talk about the standards, ideas, what should we do, what should we go for. So, you talk about the preferences. So, this is the state of affairs in the organization. So, these are our preferential stage of affairs that we should go for. So, the kind of language that you are using should be different. Then the rules, how are we going to direct the behavior of the employees, and the deals, we are going to bargain and exchange with the employees in the process, right. So, you need to ensure that the language that you are going to use is very coherent, that makes sense, it does not have any ambiguity, it is very clear. You are talking in terms of change language, and then depending upon the requirement, the language also changes, right. So, when you are seeking support, then you use a different language. When you are asking them to follow certain things in terms of rules and regulations, you use a different language, right. Then moving further, you use basically 2 different kind of language, that is imagery and common language, like using metaphors, right, influences the image of change. These are the different kind of metaphors that could be used, like machine language, based on the fixed and maintain view, right. It means that is purely mechanical language that we are using, right. Okay, this is what needs to be done and this is how it is to be done. So, the way you are going to communicate looks purely mechanical in nature, right. Then developmental language, build and develop you. Okay. This is where we are and this is where we need to go. So, that is a developmental approach. So, the kind of language that you are going to use and the kind of image of the change that you are going to have would be different. Then transitional, okay. It means based on move and relocate. So, we need to move from this state of affairs to a new state of affairs, right. And finally, transformational, okay, which is based on the idea of liberate and recreate. Okay. We need to liberate ourselves from what we have been doing and then we need to recreate our business, we need to recreate our process, we need to recreate our products. Okay. So, if that is so, then it becomes more transformational. So, these are the 4 different kind of change images that could be there. Now, in order to express these change images, what kind of words and sentences are being used by the people, so that it makes sense. If it does not make sense, then it is going to be detrimental to the process, change process. So, you need to use a common change language, and depending upon the requirement, you need to use language, okay, which makes better sense. Moving further, what we are going to talk about is communication with outside, that is equally important. It is not that you are going to communicate only internally within the organization, but you are also going to communicate with external stakeholders, your suppliers, your vendors, okay, institutional investors, right. So, you are not going to develop a strategy for communicating internally, but also externally. Now, the idea here is that how we are going to communicate externally with other stakeholders in the process, who have some kind of stake, right. Now, if you look at the research, one of the things that have been talked about is impression management. You need to create impression. So, the basic idea of communicating with outside world is to create a good impression for the organization, so that the kind of image that you have among the outsiders through your communication, whether it is through PR, whether it is through media, any kind of media, so that you are able to create a good impression for the organization. So, you use certain impression management tactics, practices, so that you are able to protect your organization from negative reactions, right. Because outside world is very important. What kind of perception an outside world will have, or the other stakeholders who are outside the organization will have, depends upon how you are going to communicate, and whether you are able to manage a good impression for yourself among the stakeholders or not, right. So, these are the 4 kind of reactions that have been identified, that is to be looked into or examined, like excuses. Do not make excuses, right, that is very important. If an organization starts making excuses, then it is not able to create a good impression about itself. Excuses because you are offering products which may not be good, and then you take it back, right. So, the products or services that you offer, it is related to that one. Then justifications, providing justifications for not doing certain things, then you create a bad image, right. So, the kind of impression that you are having will not be good, and then disclaimers, make sure that you are not going to do it, because the stakeholders are not interested in these kind of things. So, you also need to take responsibility. The moment you go for disclaiming certain things, then it would have a negative impact on the impression that the organization is going to have, right. So, you need to communicate it in such a way, so that these kind of negative reactions are not being created in the eyes of the stakeholders, who would create a bad image, a bad impression for the organization. Then concealment, do not hide certain things. You need to clearly communicate related to your products and services, what you offer, what you are not offering, your ingredients related to the products, right. So, that you are able to create a image which is more accurate, more transparent, and that is how you are going to develop an impression about the organization as such to the outside world, and that is equally important. So, the point that we are going to make here is that while you are going to communicate internally to gain support and commitment from the employees, and then you use certain skills that we have talked about, like listening, telling stories, handling talk slurs. You also need to communicate with outside world to create a good image. So, you need to develop a strategy or tactics that how you can create good impression. So, when you are going to create good impression, you need to develop certain strategies. What could be these strategies, how you can develop good impression? So, you are going to talk about facts and figures, you are going to talk about your products and services, right. So, that you are able to create trust among the people or the other stakeholders who are going to buy your products and services, right. So, communicating with outside world is equally important. So, what are the strategies that could be used when it comes to communicating with outside? Sense giving strategies. So, you need to ensure that strategic changes that are taking place, okay, are aligned with your current understanding and standards, and the frames a change as deviating from the current standard. So, two kind of sense giving strategies are used, that is acquiescence and balancing sense giving. Okay. The acquiescence means that is your current understanding and standards are going to be aligned with what you are going to have after the change, and then balancing sense giving means that yes, there is going to be a change which is deviating from the current standards, right. Or you are going for a crisis management, that could also be strategies where you are going to manage threats for the survival of the organization. So, try to create an image which is much more positive in nature, and then reputation, that is very important. You need to create corporate reputation. Okay. So, what you need to go for? Corrective actions, maintaining your image, denying something about the organization if it is being spread, or there is a certain rumors, right. So, to be different media, you need to deny it vehemently, that no, you are not doing it, and then shifting blame. You say that you are not responsible, or somebody else is responsible for this. So, these are the corrective actions that could be taken up, right, to develop a more positive reputation and image for the organization. Okay. Thank you very much.